Our gospel reading this morning is from John chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. When Judas had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me. And as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be aligned and acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. One day in November of 1993, I was walking down the hallway of my high school, and I was informed that I was probably going to be sent to in-school suspension that day. And the reason that I was going to be sent to in-school suspension, now that is a room that they would send students who were being punished so they could do their schoolwork in isolation. And I, for one, was not someone that was always getting in trouble. I made good grades and had never been to anything like that before. But the reason that I was told that I might get sent to in-school suspension that day was because I was unaware that a new dress code had taken effect. And I was wearing some shoes that were not allowed to be worn any longer. These were chunky red boots with big thick soles called Doc Martens, which is the name of the company that makes them. They were ugly as all get out, and they cost me about $100. And they were going to put me in school suspension for that. So sure enough, I was yanked out of the hallway, and I was sent to the principal's office, and they sent me down to this little room where I remained for the rest of the day. And the next day I showed up, of course, in tennis shoes, and I had found out that the student body had organized a protest. Now, usually I wouldn't participate in something like that, but it was such a nice day outside. And, you know, there really wasn't a whole lot going on in school that particular day. And these were $100 shoes. So, I mean, I had a lot on the line. And I had saved up my money to buy them and everything. And so, yes, I walked out with the rest of the students around lunchtime. Now, the protest was quite a success. It got a lot of attention in the local media and a little bit of national attention as well. And there was actually even a group of students who were invited to go on the, get this, the Phil Donahue show, if you can remember. Probably a name you haven't heard in a long time. But the reason, you might be wondering why in the world would a certain pair of shoes be banned on a school dress code. And in the early 90s, there was a lot of concern around gangs and gang violence. That was a big deal. And even in suburban Grapevine High School in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, even though this was not a school with a lot of violence or anything, the staff and administration thought it was necessary to take preventative measures in banning certain clothing that could be deemed gang-affiliated. So, jackets with certain team logos were on the list. You weren't allowed to wear those. And my beloved red chunky boots were also on the list because they had been worn by a small group of white supremacists before they'd become very popular. And that was the rationale. But after this protest, they were taken off the list and I was allowed to wear them again. And whether or not you think that that's a good idea to treat problems like this with banning school clothing or measures like that, you have to admit that clothing is one of the ways that we designate who is in a certain social group and who is out. So for example, during basketball season, we imagine we can tell a lot about a person, whether they wear that ugly reddish color or the royal blue of the... I'm just kidding, I love them both. Just wanted to find out where everyone was. So. And clothing, of course, isn't the only way that we do that. In the 12 to 18 months of the presidential election year that just seems to go on and on and on forever, we all of a sudden find out who's affiliated with this political group or the other one. And we do that with yard signs or lapel pins or bumper stickers or obnoxious Facebook posts, things like that. And you know, it could be somewhat helpful to have this way to understand things about other people without the ability to play 20 questions. It might be helpful by looking at someone's clothing or their social designations about things that you should say or shouldn't say around them. It can be a helpful tool. But the problem, I think, with the way that we draw lines around ourselves is that they don't always stay put. So the lines that we draw around ourselves, putting us in one social group, now in 5 or 10 years we find the lines have changed a little bit, and all of a sudden the group that we thought that we were in, suddenly we find ourselves outside of it. Or the group that we are in suddenly becomes subdivided into smaller and smaller and smaller sections of pie. You can look at the church, for example. In the 16th century, Martin Luther was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church. And he started the Lutheran Church, which is the first of many splits in the Protestant Reformation, and the first of many denominations stretching from that time to now. And we've seen the emergence of the Baptists and the Anabaptists and the Methodists and the Lutherans and the Anglicans and the Episcopals and the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and the Church of God, the Church of Christ. You got all the different denominations that are out there. And what happens is you have a group of people inside of a certain denomination who all of a sudden decide that they can't do church the way that the others in the group do church, and so they decide to split. And the things that have split church congregations over the years have been varied and many. So, for example, in some churches it was very important as to whether or not they allow organs. We think we should have an organ in the church, and other people say no, we should not have any instruments at all. A cappella singing only, and so they decide to split. And some churches would say, well, an organ is okay, but we don't want a rock band up there, so they decide to split. Then there are churches who go through this discernment over how it is that people should be baptized. Some people believe that infants should be baptized as soon as possible, and others say, no, that's not the way we should do it. You should have a believer's baptism, that once a person is old enough to decide for themselves if they want to be Christian, that's when we baptize. And so those people split. And they say, well, we should baptize by sprinkling water on the head. And others say, no, you need to dunk people in the water. That's the way you do a baptism, and that causes them to split. And then you have issues like, who is allowed to come to this table? Some say that only after you have made a confession of faith and only after you have been baptized should you be allowed to participate in the Lord's Supper. And other people say, no, we should allow anyone who wants to come to this table, come to the table. And so they decide to split. Some people say, we should allow everyone in the church, even the you-know-whos. And other people say, well, that's just crazy. And so they split. Now, I don't mean any disrespect to other denominations. Of course, I think that the things that were very controversial 100 or 200 years ago that seem silly to us now should inform us that our great-great-grandchildren will probably scratch their heads at the things that we think are very important in this period of time. But with all of the criticism of denominations aside, that's not really what I want to do. I think there's a lot of right ways to worship God. I do feel compelled to challenge some of these lines that we draw between ourselves, because ultimately I don't believe in them. I don't believe that they're real. You know, I think that they're arbitrary and they're artificial in the way that we draw these lines amongst one another. Now, the reason I think that is because a couple of weeks ago we saw what happened in Boston with the bombing. And for about a week, it did not matter what neighborhood you were from in that town. For about a week, it did not matter if you were Republican or a Democrat or white or black or rich or poor. For about a week, everyone in that town was united. And everyone in this country almost was united around Boston. We were all Bostonians for about a week. You saw the same thing happen after 9/11. I remember in the days, in the weeks, in the months after that tragedy, I remember walking down the streets, and you could just feel it. You could feel it amongst everyone else that we were all, for just that period of time, Americans. There was no more liberal or conservative or rich or poor, any of these other lines that we draw amongst each other. We were all just Americans, and we were united. But then what happens? Period of time passes. Period of time that's getting shorter and shorter and shorter as these things happen again and again and again and again. And the media, which gives us this constant 24-hour, 7-day-a-week coverage of over-coverage and over-commentary and overexposure, just wrings us dry of any amount of compassion or feeling that we can have until we're just left exhausted and cynical. And then all of a sudden it becomes important again about who's liberal and who's conservative. And these lines that had disappeared for that glorious, wonderful moment of time start to descend upon us again. And it disturbs me that it takes these types of tragedies like Newtown, Connecticut, or 9/11, or the Boston bombings to draw all of us together. I mean, why can't we all just be Americans? Why can't we all just be Christians? Why do we have to be Baptist or Catholic or anything else? In the passage that we read this morning, Jesus has gathered his disciples together for the last time. He's getting ready to leave them. And you can imagine the apprehension and the anxiousness of the people in that room. Once Jesus is gone, who is going to lead them? Once Jesus is gone, who is going to speak for them? Who is going to protect them? Who is going to make sure that the forces from the outside, the Pharisees, the religious authorities, or the Roman Empire bearing down upon them doesn't rip them apart? What is going to hold this community together in the years to come when all of a sudden those who were baptized after the age of 13 feel like they can no longer share space at the table with those who were baptized as infants? And what Jesus says is, I give to you a new commandment, to love one another as I have loved you. To love one another as I have loved you. That is how the world will know that you belong to me. And I get caught on that phrase, as I have loved you, because this is a difficult kind of love. In this broader scene, this is the scene when Jesus washes the feet of all of the disciples. And this new commandment comes right in the middle of two amazing betrayals. It comes right after Judas leaves the room to go and perform his betrayal. And it comes right before he tells Peter that, Peter, you will deny me 3 times before the dawn. The love that he's talking about is a very difficult love. It's a sacrificial, serving love. He says, this love you should have with one another, and it is this that will hold you together. Now, I think that's beautiful, except I have one question. Is this not just another way of drawing a line around who's in and who's out? All of us inside love one another, and then there's everyone else out there. Well, that's the interesting thing about love. Because when you see love is the line that we draw around each other, it's a permeable line. It's a line that anyone can cross. That kind of community, that kind of love is like a party where the doors are wide open and the smell of the good food and the music and the dancing is free to drift down the streets, and anyone is invited to come all in. When love is the line that we draw around one another, we become like a beacon of light. We don't have to convince other people that we're light. If we're light, we just shine the light. And people will see that light and they will be attracted to it. They'll come in to this church and they'll go, I don't know what it is about these people, but they just love one another. They just have this mutual affection. Well, they agree on all the right? No, they don't agree on hardly anything. But they have this love. And I don't know what it is, but I want to be a part of it. I can feel it when I come in this room. When love is the line that we draw around one another, when it's love that holds us together, we become an attractive force that pulls anyone in to become a part of it. And here's the thing about that love. In the coming months, maybe it'll be 6 to 9 months, maybe a year, you're going to hear a lot of us talking about 3 questions that I want everyone to be asking themselves. As we enter this new phase of ministry here at Simpsonville Christian Church, I want to challenge the congregation to ask themselves 3 questions. And we're going to explore these questions, and we're going to go through these questions. And the first one is, who are we? I mean, what makes us unique? What makes us different? What makes us especially called to do the work of God in the world? After all, we are unique. This is the only congregation exactly like it in the history of Christianity. There has never been another Simpsonville Christian Church in 2013, ever. We are unique. What makes us unique? What do we do better than anyone else? What do we do that lights all of us up? The second question is, what does this community need? This is the only Simpsonville, Kentucky in 2013. And this community, this town, this county, this state, this country, this world has unique needs that has never been expressed in the history of the world. What are they? And the third question is, given what we know about number 1 and number 2, the third question is, what are we going to do about it? And that will become the attractive force. That will be how we express the love that we have here. And this is why the love is important. When we have these meetings, when we have these discussions, when we set out on intentional explorations of these questions, who are we, what does this community need, and what are we going to do about it? I don't want us to all come into a room and agree on everything. That means we're not doing it. We should be arguing. We should be wrestling. We should be refuting and pushing up against one another. Somebody should say one thing and someone else should challenge that. This needs to be an intentional process that gets at something deep. And the only way that we can do that is if we have the mutual affection of the same love that is given to us through Christ Jesus by God. That's the only way we can do it. It's the only way that we can have honest conversations and disagree with one another to get at something deeper. And so I challenge all of you to think about that. And I challenge all of you to dig down deep and find that sense of mutual affection that we have for one another. I challenge all of you to obey that new commandment, to take it seriously and to understand it's much more difficult than first meets the eye. That we are called to love one another. Amen.